As the fallout from the pandemic continues to evolve, one of the questions that people who are upset about what happened to them, whether or not they lost their jobs and the mandates and they're suing the government or their companies, but what about people who are injured? Who is responsible? Where does responsibility lie? These are big questions, and there is no easy answer. But luckily for us today, we have a lawyer who is willing to take on these big cases and challenge that question about liability, responsibility. Who actually is responsible? Could it be the doctors who didn't actually administer the vaccines? Is it public health? Is it the government? Is it that no one is responsible? And if there are injuries, it is your problem because it was experimental use. It was not yet fully authorized. Emergency use authorization, I was going to say. Where is the responsibility? So, what we will do, without further ado, we'll bring in Lisa and have her take us through the legalities of what's going on. Lisa, thank you very much for joining me. And I would like you first to just do a quick introduction to the audience.
Hi, everybody. It's very nice to be here with you on Dr. Phillips' podcast. I'm a lawyer of 25 years in Canada. I have a Bachelor of Science, the minor in chemistry, and a Master's of Law in conflicts of interest. I sued the government in Canada on the first SARS case representing Nelia La Rosa. I've been writing on Substack on COVID and freedom issues. And I wanted to come here today to discuss a recent European Commission decision. And I'd like to say, while I am a lawyer, I'm not your lawyer, and we should still get legal advice if we're really considering a personal action. So on that
Excellent, excellent, Lisa. So let's get straight to it. Now, before we actually do that, though, I just want to clarify what would make you take on the government in that first SARS epidemic in Canada? Why did you feel the need to do that? Because I'm sure that wasn't an easy decision.
At the time, the case was framed as a representation of bad faith, in that they were representing, the allegations were that they were representing SARS was not present, that there was no need for PPE. And in fact, there were even punitive regimes where if nurses were putting their PPE on. So, that was the allegations at the time. And I'm not totally free to discuss the outcome of the case because it's protected. But it really caused me to dive in to the pandemic that we recently experienced, and to have a sort of a critical eye in terms of what was going on and how things were different. And so I've been following it since 2022, and certainly with respect to when the truckers in Canada were contesting the mandates so significantly.
Yeah, well, what I think I was getting at, Lisa, is that clearly you are one of those people who are not afraid to take on big cases. And that's what I was interested in, really. Your personality clearly draws you to this situation where you are tackling the Goliath against the David almost. Is that part of your personality?
I would say it is. Just this sort of idea where I see injustice, it really inflames me. It really does. And this might be a funny story, but to some, or a nut bar story. I was walking, I remember, across campus, and there was a dog on leash. He was quite ferocious, and he was attacking a squirrel quite bloodily. And there was a whole crowd around watching. And I walked right up to the dog, and blood in the squirrel. And I was demanding, whose dog was this? And what? and I grabbed the squirrel from the dog, and it was at a vet college, and took the squirrel to the vet college, and I thought to myself afterwards, I was willing to go right in there in front of a dog and its prey in its mouth, and had no qualms about it. And I thought, what kind of personality do I have?
That
So
sounds exactly like what it is. And so at this time, people like you are so critical, Lisa, because at the moment, so many people are just watching injustice all around them and just looking the other way. It's a terrible situation, and it's one that makes me reflect on when I think about what happened in the Second World War. You think, okay, I can see how those things happen. So we need brave people like you to draw and challenge these issues. So let's just think firstly about the situation. You had emergency use authorization during COVID. People were afraid. They knew this was emergency use authorization. They knew we didn't have long-term studies on it. Why are they not responsible for their own actions?
you mean individuals?
Yeah.
Individuals who don't have the medical background. So I don't think in society we want to pass on the liability to those least able to parse, the information and understand it. There was a pressure, and I'll acknowledge, on the individual to take it, right? And that pressure came from a lot of different sources, including employment, shaming, media. And so then they would look to their medical teams to speak up. And we both know why doctors didn't speak up. And that is the topic of my upcoming book, World on Mute, which looks at professional bodies and speech committees across a whole array, across all OECD and beyond countries, and how it was coordinated. So we know both individuals were shamed and pushed and incentivized, and in fact coerced. And we know that doctors were silenced. But now we have a new decision in the European court, and I'm not a European lawyer, and I can't, provide an opinion in law in that respect, but I can give you how I interpret it. And the request was to withdraw the sort of the advertising or the presence of the shots on the market, and the court refused. And in refusing, they indicated something quite important. Two things: that doctors were always free not to administer the shots, and to advise against it. And in the second instance, that the doctor should have been providing prescriptions for this COVID vaccine. And so that's a lot to unpack. And there's a lot of directions we can go with that. And I can talk about what some analysis is going through and suggesting. But that's, I'll leave it there in case you want to jump in and ask a few questions about that.
Yeah, I think the first thing that I want to clarify is that why was the European Court of Justice, in any case, looking at this? Who brought this in front of them, and why?
Professor Farigi, I hope I'm saying his name correctly. And it was why he was brought in was to challenge the marketing authorization, that the marketing authorization for the COVID shots. And it was a great salvo to attempt. And that he ought to have won. he ought to have won, in my opinion. He lost, but in Oberter, and in order to justify not withdrawing the marketing authorizations for the COVID vaccines, they put the doctor in this new position that we didn't actually see the doctor in so much in the pandemic. And they say, well, the doctor should have been giving prescriptions, and we can break out and just discuss that part, because I can tell you what the experience here in Canada was. Should have been giving prescriptions, and we're always free to advise against it. So,
Wait,
and we can unpack that.
Can we pause there a minute? So what you're saying is that actually the case was brought initially to withdraw the marketing and the use of COVID vaccines to the European Court of Justice. They lost the case to do that, but in the process, the judges then made statements that put doctors front and center in terms of responsibility. Why would they do that?
Well, now, in order to say that we're going to keep whatever it is that the European Union had for the marketing authorizations for these shots on the market, we're going to leave them as is, and we don't have to withdraw it no matter what the evidence is, because guess who's there? Guess who's there? The doctors are. The doctors are there, and if there's a problem with these things, they can advise against it. And in all cases, they should have, been providing prescriptions for this. And I know here that a good portion of vaccines were simply set up on an online, entry where your information and an appointment was set up. And you might have talked to an individual. They were a call center individual. Those individuals would give you the time that best suited you in the location that best suited you. And then it was a mill. It was a vaccine mill. There at no point did you seem to touch base with any doctors. So there's a vast amount of people that went to those mills or were sent to pharmacies. And again, at the pharmacy, they would not have been given informed consent. And, for deciding on who is vaccine injured or not, they wouldn't, if they died after the vaccine, they weren't even being counted as vaccine injured, because being vaccinated was defined as 21 days after your second vaccine. So you could literally die on the spot, and that would be a COVID injury as opposed to a vaccine injury. There's all kinds of problematic definitions there. But where did you actually see a doctor? So then, now the new cases where you're actually possibly seeing a doctor is you're going in for a routine examination. You have an issue. You might be pregnant. Not you, but somebody might be pregnant, and they're faced with the pressurization of a booster or getting a vaccine in those appointments. And so those are the doctors, I think, who should most fear that decision, because that decision could expose them. Here it is, written in a decision that doctors should have decided whether or not that individual should be administered that vaccine. They should be given a prescription. And so when a prescription is given, certainly what you usually get is adverse events, possibilities of a discussion with that doctor. And so it changes what was done from a push, kind of from a central authority, to now making individual doctors everywhere possibly liable because of this decision. I think is something that doctors should bring up with their insurers, and if they do have a doctor or a lawyer, should bring up with them as well.
This is fascinating. I mean, fascinatingly worrying. Now, I think I understand where you're coming from here. So let me tell you what I think you're saying, if any doctors are listening. In the first phase of the pandemic, where they were giving out the first 2 doses, that was very oftentimes done in clinics across they just set up places. People would come and they would get their vaccines. Okay. However, as the times for the boosters, certainly beyond the first to the second and the third and the fourth boosters, very often patients would come into their doctor's office and they would then be encouraged, based on your risk factors, you have certain comorbidities or you're a certain age, or they're just worried. And their doctor then says, yes, you need to get the COVID booster shot. And if they had any negative outcomes, because the doctor didn't put any concerns or questions at that time, that doctor then becomes responsible for the ongoing marketing and supply of vaccines to now their personal patient who they consulted with. Is that about right?
It is part of it. And you also have to say, were those doctors then up to speed on the downsides of the vaccines, on the possible side effects of the vaccines? Have they been following the research? Are they made aware of the research? And then how the whole system is set up, hospital-based or otherwise. What about the nurses who are talking to the patients, pushing the vaccines in the clinics? I went in for a knee surgery and my triage nurse pushed vaccines on me. So was that at the behest of the hospital system? Was that at the behest of a certain doctor? How was it that was her job to do so? So, I think if cases were brought, what would typically be done would be that there would be, third party. If you're naming me, as a doctor, I'm going to name, my professional body, for instance, that pushed the silencing and against speaking up. Or I might push my hospital system who might dock me if I don't get enough vaccine push. Or maybe I'm pushing the insurance system in the US that questions you if you're not, putting in enough vaccines. Doctors were financially paid quite well to administer vaccines. And then on the downside, they would be witnessing all those who spoke up against them fight their responsible bodies, their professional bodies, attack them. And so it's quite an odd situation where doctors, I think, would say, well, was I really free? But now you have a court saying, well, yeah, you always had the ultimate responsibility.
I did say something based on the historical stuff, the way how things go. And I said in 2021, if and when the brown stuff hits the fan, they're going to blame the doctors. Because they're going to be saying, I could imagine it. The politicians would say, well, we're following the science. The scientists would be saying, well, this is what the studies showed, but we didn't know that there were injuries. Goodness, you mean patients actually got injured and got sick? And so everybody would then start shunting responsibility, even though the doctors were at risk for speaking out. Remember, doctors were put under the threat, and in some countries, they lost their jobs for just not taking the vaccine. I'm not even talking about speaking out. Just for their job, they were required to have COVID vaccines, whether or not they had natural immunity. They just had to have them, and if they didn't get them, they would lose their jobs. In that, how could you expect doctors in that kind of environment to therefore be trying to tackle these issues?
Well, I think there's a morality out there that there's an expectation that people who hold a lot of have a lot of power should have a lot of responsibility with that power. And so I think there is the expectation that they should have en masse stepped out. And, my book really delves into that. and the pressures that we saw, that wasn't really available to the general public. But, you had the media, right? If a doctor was named, whether or not even the allegations against them were proven, you had that media, churning and churning and churning, but you never saw the good news decisions where a doctor might have won. That media never got out there. So there's a collusion and I would say almost a conspiracy at all levels. And if you let me share my screen, I would love to show 2 emails that I have. Yes, correct. So this came out of a Freedom of Information request in Canada. And Dr. Charles Hoff was one of those brave doctors in Canada that faced losing his license. And back here in the pandemic, you have him on April 7th, 2021, writing Bonnie Henry in BC, and she was the Chief Public Officer of Health for the province of BC in Canada. And he is, subject is devastating vaccine injuries. He says, "Dear Dr. Henry, I'm a family physician in Lighton, BC. I greatly appreciate the work that you have been doing on our behalf. Sadly, I have been seeing terrible side effects from the COVID vaccine in my medical practice. Please read my attached letter, which I send to you with much sadness for those who have been harmed." And in his letter, I didn't attach it here, but it delineates the injuries that he experienced from his patients after administering the vaccine. So here's a doctor stepping up. Okay. Now, the second email I have here, I hope you can see it.
Yeah, we're seeing it.
Right. Thank you, Bonnie. This is to Bonnie from Monica, right? Because they circulated among themselves in the Officer of Health office, devastating vaccine injuries among residents in Lighton. Just confirming that I've submitted a formal complaint to the CPSBC on behalf of the patients and communities affected by the actions of Dr. Hoff. Regards, Doug, which is Dr. Douglas W. Smith, because Bonnie had said, "Thanks for following up. I believe we should report this person to the college," Bonnie. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So let me just get this into context here so that the audience understands this. In effect, we have a situation where early in the pandemic, a doctor who was seeing vaccine injuries or what he perceived were vaccine injuries, he then raises the concern to public health officer or medical officer. And instead of them responding to it, they then threaten or intend to report him for actually raising questions. Now,
so I'll clarify that. He doesn't get the email until he gets an FOI. So until his lawyer gets an FOI later on. That email is internal. So between Doug and Bonnie. And so instead of showing any interest in the medical difficulties of his patients, instead of showing any interest in the vaccine injuries, what they decided to do internally, Bonnie just says in her email, we should report him to his medical professional body. And Doug says, confirms, I should have read them from the top bottom up on that, but Doug says, I've done it, right? I've done it. So there you have this little collusion between public health, which that is what, the Chief Medical Officer of Health in BC really represents, which, when we went through the national focal points of the WHO in Canada, public health is an arm of the WHO. So then you have the arm of the WHO, You have the national focal point, the public health authority, top dog, she finds out there's medical injuries, and what does she do? She instructs the staff to report him to his medical professional body. And does the CPSO for him say that this is as a result of Bonnie Henry? No, he has no idea. So that complaint, that's what those doctors were facing. So it's quite interesting to see, and I think that's the system truly that should have the liability. The speech system should have the liability. I'm not to say that there are not doctors out there who perhaps were aware or ought to have been aware of the injuries and nevertheless kept physically recommending that individuals get vaccinated. In fact, some doctors, I know there are reports where, if you follow any of the medical freedom, where they were gaslighting their patients. They were refusing to engage with patients who were reporting injuries. So certainly there is liability. There ought to be liability.
Wow. I mean, you're right. As I pull back and I reflect on that email and I look at that sequence of emails, and I do know that in the UK, Dr. Malhotra had a similar experience where, when he was speaking publicly about the risks with COVID vaccines and so on, he was also reported by a number of people to the GMC. He then challenged it and flipped the suit on them for harassment or something like that, because they didn't have the way that they had behaved in the public eye towards him. But this is how seriously some of the medical community took it. In that circumstance, why would any doctor take the risk? And now this is the bit that I want you to answer for me now, Lisa. So you have a doctor in the dock. You are the lawyer who is going for the prosecution. And the doctor says, okay, yeah, I did see some injuries, but, I didn't know for certain that it could have been because of the vaccine. What do you say?
Well, certainly if it's in the dock and I'm the prosecution, you're talking about criminal charges. So that's separate. So totally separate.
All right. No, not criminal charges.
Right. Right. But if I were suing on behalf of I suppose a vaccine injured person on the basis of that case, and this is, of course, this is totally not my legal advice, but I would say to him, what did you do to make yourself aware of all the studies that were being published? What did you do to make yourself aware of, your patients that had the vaccines? Did you follow up? There is so much intimidation in hospital systems that nurses who were, communicating with various vaccine injuries, they themselves found themselves disciplined. So I get that we need to address the doctor liability, but we need to go higher. We need to start on that basis, perhaps. If you're saying a doctor was required to have to be able to give a prescription, then I think that doctor's lawyer may want to say, well, there's third-party liability here. I'm going to claim against the system that prevented me from having all of this knowledge, and which pressurized me to indicate that these, genetic vaccines were safe and effective, because the mantra "trust the science" was definitely pushed publicly that they were safe and effective.
Now, one of the comebacks that I expect that the third party is going to say, because very often the third party is non-clinical. They are in a supervisory position. They're in an office. They're not necessarily working directly with patients. I expect that they will say, we did not know this was occurring. Now, except for the Dr. Hoff, they can't say they didn't know. But very often, for many other parts of the system in many other parts of the world, if we didn't have doctors who were overtly sending those letters or overtly speaking, can those organizations get away with saying, you know what, if they had told us that they were seeing these things, we would have done something about it?
Well, I think that stretches credulity. I think it stretches credulity to say at all that they had no awareness. I think the data is there. I think one of my theories is that the laws that are passing themselves are the evidence of conspiracy. The laws and policies and bilateral and multilateral and treaties themselves are the proof of the conspiracy. And I believe that when you set up a system to silence one side of the debate, you become responsible for what follows that silencing. So if one side of the debate is not in the public square, and that is the side of the debate that errs on caution and that is clamoring, in fact, to indicate that injuries are so rampant and so horrific among their patients, and that debate is silenced, then I believe that liability should flow to the system that did the silencing. And it's not to say that doctors in certain indications shouldn't themselves find that liability, but the system that set up that silencing is the problem.
You know, I'm reflecting carefully now, and I know that if I quietly go and speak to almost any doctor, clinician, anywhere, they're likely to be saying quietly, listen, I'm seeing stuff like I've never seen before. I don't know what it is, don't know why it's happening. And yeah, I don't know if it's COVID. I don't know if it's the vaccines. I don't know if it's a combination, but things aren't right. Okay. And I would expect that the vast majority of clinicians are thinking that. And in a quiet conversation, that's what they would say. But they have no evidence. What are they supposed to do?
Well, what do you define as evidence? Because what you're seeing is, despite those booster recommendations, you're seeing uptake of vaccine among nurses at the lowest rate. The last time I looked, it was 15%. So those are the people in the medical community that are triaging people, that are asking, their patients, and they're taking up that data. They're not getting vaccinated. And I can tell you that I have spoken to enough women after the first rollout, just such astounding. And this is personal anecdote, but at what point do personal anecdotes not add up? My aunt's niece on the other side of the family, first time I ever heard of a baby stillborn at 8 months. The 3 pregnancies in my life that were with my friends and loved ones during that period, 2 of them, the babies had to be removed. One for a calcified placenta and didn't grow, was just such a tiny little baby. And another one, they told her it was an old placenta. The amount of women who I have a nurse friend. She's the mother of my daughter's school. At my daughter's school, she, within 15 days of the first Pfizer, started to bleed. She was put on medication and it stopped it. Within a month, she was required to conform to keep her job, and she never stopped bleeding. After 3 months, they wheeled her in, and she was in her mid-30s, and she had a full hysterectomy, and she was still bleeding on the way in. She told me on her shift, 2 other nurses faced the same thing. Women, I have 2 friends who had to have their whole womb, cauterized because of the extreme amount of bleeding and clots that followed. I know a young lady, only 22, the daughter of one of my mentors, had to have a hysterectomy. And so all of this carnage that was out there, right? All of that carnage, what is evidence? What is evidence that you refuse to collect? What is evidence that you refuse to discuss? What is evidence that you're punished for bringing forth? What is the evidence? What is evidence if someone's told what their information is a conspiracy theory? Everybody's discussing this in hushed formats. And so not everybody was injured right away. Some injuries, might have followed. But whether or not there is sufficient amount of evidence, I kind of don't believe it. I kind of don't believe it at all.
I can see the passion in what you're saying. I can see the injustice that's driving you with this. When you reflect on it, what is it that is most getting you upset?
Well, we will recall romaine lettuce. We will recall a crib. There's a sense of product liability that we're used to. And there's also been an exploitation of people's trust in the medical profession without knowing how gamed it all is. Just how when we look at that Dr. Hoff email where we have someone trying to get to the evidence to the people who could stop the injuries for everybody afterwards if they treated that evidence seriously, investigated it. Now, this is one doctor, right, in one location. So if they extrapolated, how many people did he vaccinate? How many injuries did he have in that small community in his experience? And they extrapolated it around, right? But the fact they showed no curiosity, they showed no interest, and in fact, that their reaction was to punish the individual for speaking up. That is what it means, that the system is flawed itself, and it is gamed to produce the injuries, to continue the injuries, to profit from the injuries. And the profit was extreme. And then you have on the other side of it, the people who want to look at their world, look at the media, and the media is silent, and the media, produced all the heretics who spoke against it. All those heretics, they attacked them. So you have this population who keeps lining up for more injuries, and salmonella, on lettuce is treated more seriously.
As we come to the close here, Lisa, I want to, as you were saying about those injuries and so on, I had to think about something that does baffle me. For over 2 years now, embalmers, since 2021, they've been talking about these strange, unusual clots. They've been discussing them. Finally, we're having some people in the scientific community looking at them, and these things we have never seen before. They are having patterns that we have never seen. I am genuinely trying to understand who is likely to be responsible if and when this turns out to be a massive risk to patients that has been causing injuries and issues that has been completely ignored by the medical and scientific community. How would you position that?
Look, I think you have to go for the head of the snake. The whole system has to be retrofitted to be patient-oriented, to be consent-oriented, to compensate for injuries at the head of the snake. One of the things I wanted to discuss before we move on, and if we're close to the end, is that some people have interpreted that this decision might be a way for those who are now persecuted by their professional bodies to say, well, I'm free to say no to my patients because the court has said that doctors can advise against us. The court has said that. So my worry is that this is, in my respectful opinion, a weaponized system for silence. And the doctors are silenced often for concepts of misinformation or disinformation that differs from the standard of care. So it sort of dilutes the relationship between the doctor and their patient by interposing a body that becomes responsible for a standard of care. And so if you speak against something that is different than the standard of care, if you do something that is different from the standard of care, then you can lose your license, right? So my point there is, it is not the same thing to give legal responsibility to the doctors for the liability as it is to say, now that they have that legal responsibility, that can translate them from being free from their professional bodies, labeling them misinformation. Because while misinformation or disinformation allegations against doctors are going forth, there is in the public domain enough information that justifies their speech. And yet, in so many instances, their speech speaking against the vaccines nevertheless took them away and separated them from the ability to practice and silence them. And what we're seeing is that this is a whole system. And that's what my book is about. The world is on mute, and they are using the system of speech bodies. And it's not just against doctors. It's against lawyers. It's against MPs. Very dangerously, it's against our people who are counselors. So you think you're going to get political change. But if you have the ability to side check all those who would speak for your views by using a organization such as a speech committee, right, to remove that person's ability to earn a living, what you're eventually going to do is you're going to corner the whole market in the entire world. You have to agree with power in order to earn a living. And so you don't need courts. By just empowering speech committees to such an extent, you get to corner and organize the world. And I'll give you an example why you want to read my book even if you're a lawyer or you're just interested, because these speech committees are everywhere now. It's ubiquitous. Every way to earn a living is being cornered. What we're seeing for the doctors is for everyone. Okay? And it's on every topic. It's a behemoth. It's a whole system. Now imagine every lawyer who wanted to bring the types of cases that defended medical freedom, that defended freedom of speech. If you were able to side check them, intimidate them through their legal body, through that body, then those cases would never be brought. And the Constitution in most OECD countries operates in such a fashion that the judicial branch may make checks on abuses of power in the legislative, administrative, these quasi-judicial branches of the speech committee and the executive branch. If you are unable to bring the cases, then the whole Constitution is gone. It's gone. That the checks on power are gone. So you're emboldening, through speech committees, the ability to check not only the speech of doctors, but the speech of politicians, the speech of lawyers, the speech of teachers. And so all of that speech, I suggest in my book, and I theorize in my book, that it's all interwoven to capture our society. And so the doctors, the medical doctors, they were, the canaries. They were the first ones battling the speech committees with respect to what they were experiencing. And you would have thought that the professional bodies in medicine would have been very curious and show some interest into actual science, i.e., what is observed. What is observed is science, right? It's not what is published.
Wow. I mean, I didn't want to interrupt you there, Lisa. You were on a roll. So listen, as we close out now, what do you say to a doctor? I'm talking, or let's say someone else. They're quietly talking to you, and they are talking about what you're saying, and they're worried about their own liability. What should they do at this point?
Well, I think they do have a possibility of lawsuits being brought, and whether or not that's upheld in court or not, however these new decisions get taken. Even the lawsuit itself is punitive. The process itself is punitive. I think medical doctors en masse have to understand where it is we're going. And to do that, they have to look at an organization such as TEDS, the European Health Data Space. And that is all the acts that deal with health data. Health is now defined as 9 sectoral data spaces. They have to look that health is to be administered for the most part through AI, that face-to-face healthcare will be the last resort. And so are we possibly looking at a system where how many doctors would you need if face-to-face healthcare is a last resort? And face-to-face healthcare is not defined as doctor-patient relationship. So they've been silent for too long. I would say to doctors, they've been silent for too long. The path that we're facing broadly in society, being administered as algorithms of data, is also discussed in my book. And they have to understand that the system they thought was set up to protect doctors to a certain extent, right? Their medical, that was about competency, right? It wasn't about silence. They have to take on that. They have to take on that. Come what may, that's what they have to take on.
Wow. Listen, Lisa, I know this is going to be a topic that we're going to have to explore further. And I'm looking forward to when you have this book ready, A World on Mute. As soon as that is published, I will want to bring you with probably some other doctors. This is huge, and we do need lawyers like you to stand to tell us where the dangers are and to tell us what to do to be able to challenge them. Really appreciate all that you've done by coming here. Thank you very much, Lisa. I'm sure I'll be talking with you again in the near future.
I hope so. Thank you, Dr. McMillan. And thanks for the opportunity to discuss. I hope to hear how our discussion goes with your community.
Wonderful. Thank you.